Biography. Che Guevara, the rebel who tried to change the world. Who was Che Guevara? Born in Argentina in 1928, Ernesto Che Guevara became one of the most iconic revolutionary figures of the 20th century. Trained as a doctor, he journeyed across Latin America and witnessed the stark inequalities that transformed his medical mission into a political one. Guevara rose to prominence during the Cuban Revolution, where his courage, intellect, and ruthless determination made him a key figure in overthrowing Batista's regime. But Che wasn't done. He left Cuba to ignite revolution across the globe, from the jungles of Congo to the mountains of Bolivia. Loved by some, hated by others, Guevara remains a symbol of resistance, defiance, and idealism. His life was cut short at just 39 years old, but his image still fuels debates and revolutions today. Was Che Guevara a freedom fighter or a dangerous idealist? Let us know in the comments. 1. Birth of a revolutionary, 1928. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, a riverport city in the province of Santa Fe, Argentina. Rosario was one of the country's largest urban centers at the time, an important hub for commerce, agriculture, and politics. The Argentina of 1928 was experiencing both modernization and turbulence. The country had a strong agricultural economy, largely driven by exports to Europe and the United States, but it was also marked by deep inequalities and an elite-dominated political system. The middle and working classes were beginning to assert themselves more forcefully in the political arena, with labor movements and leftist ideologies gaining traction. Ernesto was the eldest of 5 children. His family belonged to Argentina's educated, middle-class elite. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was a civil engineer of mixed Spanish and Irish descent. He had liberal, anti-establishment ideas and was known to be a supporter of progressive causes. Guevara Lynch was particularly fond of literature and was open about his admiration for figures such as José Martí and the Spanish anarchists. He passed many of his beliefs on to his son. Che's mother, Celia de la Serna, came from an aristocratic background with Basque and Spanish roots. She was exceptionally well educated for a woman of her time. Fluent in multiple languages and trained in philosophy and literature, she provided a rigorous intellectual environment at home. She had studied at university and worked briefly in publishing and education before her marriage. She was politically active and outspoken in her opposition to fascism and militarism. Celia also maintained friendships with artists, writers, and thinkers from Argentina's cultural elite. Ernesto grew up in a household filled with books, discussions on politics, and a general openness to new ideas. The Guevara home hosted poets, political activists, and scholars, giving young Ernesto a front-row seat to the intellectual debates of the day. His early education was strongly shaped by his parents' interests. Even before he was formally enrolled in school, Che had access to a personal library containing volumes of Marx, Engels, Freud, Neruda, and Kipling. From a young age, Ernesto showed signs of sharp intelligence and curiosity. He was particularly drawn to geography, philosophy, and history. According to his father, Che had read Karl Marx's Das Kapital by the time he was 14, though later scholars suggest this may have been more aspirational than literal. Nonetheless, he was undeniably precocious and intensely committed to understanding the world. Argentina's political environment in the late 1920s and 1930s was increasingly unstable. President Hipólito Yrigoyen, who had been in office since 1916, was overthrown in a military coup in 1930, ushering in the so-called infamous decade. This era was marked by electoral fraud, repression of political dissent, and growing dissatisfaction among the working class. The rise of fascism in Europe and growing US influence in Latin America were also subjects of household conversation. These external pressures, combined with internal contradictions, created the conditions for the radicalization of many young Argentines in Che's generation. Ernesto's early exposure to these political dynamics was foundational. His parents encouraged independent thinking, but they also instilled a sense of responsibility toward the disadvantaged. While Guevara was not yet politically active, his moral compass was being formed in an environment where injustice was a frequent topic. This would be the soil in which his revolutionary consciousness began to take root. 2. Childhood and battle with asthma, 1930s-1940s. Ernesto Guevara's childhood was dominated by a constant struggle with severe asthma, a condition that shaped both his personality and his path in life. Diagnosed early in life, his asthma attacks were frequent and dangerous, often requiring urgent intervention. At a time when modern asthma treatments like inhalers and corticosteroids were not yet widely available, his family relied on rudimentary treatments, such as herbal remedies, steaming, and strong doses of ephedrine. His mother, Celia, kept meticulous records of his attacks, and his father often stayed up at night to monitor his breathing. The illness influenced every aspect of his upbringing. The Guevara family relocated multiple times throughout Argentina in search of climates that might ease his symptoms. They lived in Córdoba, a mountainous city with drier air than Rosario, in hopes that the altitude would reduce the severity of his condition. These relocations often disrupted his formal schooling, but they also allowed him to become self-reliant. Because of the frequent interruptions in his schooling due to his health, Ernesto became largely self-educated. His mother took on the responsibility of tutoring him at home, introducing him to subjects beyond the typical curriculum, particularly philosophy, literature, and political history. While many boys his age were engaged in outdoor games and social events, Ernesto spent long hours reading authors like Jules Verne, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Bertrand Russell. He also developed an early interest in chess, which became a lifelong hobby. The effect of chronic illness on Ernesto was profound. Rather than turning him inward or making him dependent, it instilled in him a fierce sense of discipline and willpower. His father would later remark that Che learned to overcome suffering by confronting it directly. His determination to defy the limitations imposed by asthma became a central theme of his youth. He took up strenuous physical activities like rugby and swimming, often against his doctor's advice. Although these pursuits would sometimes trigger severe asthma attacks, he refused to see himself as weak or limited. Socially, Ernesto did not always fit in with his peers. His intense reading habits and intellectual interests set him apart. He could be confrontational in arguments and held strong opinions even from a young age. However, those close to him described him as generous, loyal, and compassionate. His experiences with illness and physical vulnerability seemed to have heightened his sensitivity to the suffering of others. It was during this time that Guevara began to display a keen awareness of social injustice. Living in cities where class divisions were sharply visible, he asked questions about why poverty existed, why some people suffered more than others, and what caused inequality. These weren't merely academic concerns. The sight of laborers struggling for food, indigenous families marginalized by society, and friends affected by economic hardship deeply disturbed him. His relationship with domestic workers in the Guevara household also contributed to this early awareness. Unlike many Argentine middle-class children of his time, Ernesto showed empathy and respect for the indigenous and mestizo workers who helped raise him. He asked about their families and lives and was affected by the disparity between their treatment and his own privilege. In high school, he began to socialize more and even gained a reputation for being charismatic, if unconventional. He was known for quoting philosophers during debates and challenging teachers when he disagreed with their interpretations. He also became known for his dry wit and fearless criticism of authority figures, traits that would later serve him well as a political figure. By the time he graduated, Ernesto had already endured more physical suffering than many people experience in a lifetime. Yet rather than being broken by it, he seemed to have been hardened. His body remained fragile, but his spirit was increasingly unbreakable. He had developed a worldview shaped by reading, observation, and personal pain, one that saw inequality as a human failure and resistance as a moral obligation. 3. Medical studies and first political influences, 1947 to 1951. In 1947, at the age of 19, Ernesto Guevara enrolled in the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. His choice of profession reflected a desire to understand and combat human suffering, which he had both experienced personally through asthma and observed in the lives of the working poor. While his parents were skeptical of his ability to handle the academic and physical demands of medical school, Guevara quickly proved them wrong. He approached his studies with the same intensity and discipline that had characterized his battle with illness. Medical school in Argentina during the late 1940s was rigorous, steeped in traditional anatomical science but increasingly influenced by social medicine, a field that examined how socio-economic conditions influenced public health. Guevara showed particular interest in the treatment of leprosy and other diseases that disproportionately affected impoverished communities. He read extensively about the work of Dr. Salvador Moza, an Argentine physician who had pioneered public health efforts against tropical diseases in underdeveloped areas of Latin America. It was during this period that Ernesto began to broaden his academic curiosity beyond medicine. He was drawn to the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which were circulating widely in leftist student circles across Latin America. While he did not yet consider himself a Marxist, Guevara was increasingly sympathetic to anti-colonial movements and socialist critiques of global capitalism. He saw medicine not only as a scientific discipline but as a tool for addressing the root causes of inequality. His belief that a physician's duty extended beyond the individual patient and into the realm of social justice began to take shape. Outside the classroom, Ernesto formed a tight circle of friends who were politically active and intellectually curious. He engaged in late-night discussions about philosophy, politics, and ethics. Topics ranged from existentialism to Peronism, the nationalist populist movement that was then dominant in Argentine politics. Guevara was critical of Juan Perón's authoritarian tendencies, even though he agreed with some of the regime's labor policies. He believed that Peronism, like many reformist movements, was ultimately insufficient for achieving genuine social transformation. One of Guevara's closest friends during this period was Alberto Granado, a biochemist with socialist leanings who encouraged Ernesto's growing interest in social activism. Together, they worked part-time in health clinics and discussed the limitations of Argentina's healthcare system. Their observations convinced them that disease was often a symptom of broader economic and political dysfunction. This conclusion would become a recurring theme in Guevara's life, that medical practice alone could not cure the structural causes of human suffering. During his final years of medical school, Guevara began to write essays and journals reflecting on the moral responsibilities of physicians. In these early writings, one can detect the emergence of a revolutionary ethic. He argued that doctors should not isolate themselves from the realities of poverty and oppression. Instead, they should be active participants in building a more just society. These texts, though still tentative in their ideological clarity, foreshadowed the radical transformation that was soon to come. As Guevara approached the completion of his degree, his dissatisfaction with the status quo grew stronger. He found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the clinical detachment required of a physician with the moral urgency he felt when treating the poor. While he remained committed to finishing his medical training, it became clear to those around him that Guevara was beginning to see his future role not in hospitals but in the broader political struggles of the continent. By 1951, with his medical studies nearly complete, Ernesto decided to take a break from academia and embark on a journey that would change the trajectory of his life forever. Together with Alberto Granado, he planned a motorcycle expedition across Latin America. They named their vehicle La Poderosa II, the Mighty One, a reference both to the bike's power and their aspirations. It was to be a grand adventure, but also a quest to understand the real conditions of the continent's people. This journey, which began as a youthful exploration, would ultimately serve as the crucible in which the doctor would begin to transform into the revolutionary. 4. The motorcycle journey across Latin America, 1951 to 1952. In January 1952, Ernesto Guevara and his friend Alberto Granado set out from Buenos Aires on a dilapidated 1939 Norton 500 cubic centimeters motorcycle, which they affectionately called La Poderosa II, the Mighty One. Their goal was to travel over 5,000 miles, approximately 8,000 kilometers, across South America in search of adventure, but what they encountered on the road would shift the course of Guevara's life forever. They began their journey with a sense of excitement, fueled by idealism and a thirst for knowledge. Their initial route took them through the Argentine Pampas, into the Andes, across the Atacama Desert, and deep into the Amazon basin. They passed through Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. Throughout the expedition, they faced numerous mechanical breakdowns, illness, and financial hardship. Eventually, La Poderosa II broke down for good in Chile, and the rest of their journey was completed on foot, by bus, truck, or hitchhiking. What distinguished this journey from a typical road trip was Guevara's intense observation of the people and conditions he encountered. As they moved further from urban centers, the contrast between the lives of the wealthy elite and the working poor became increasingly stark. In Chile, they met copper miners living in near-feudal conditions, exploited by foreign corporations and local oligarchs. Guevara took note of how workers were denied basic rights and were forced to labor under dangerous, inhumane circumstances. He observed malnourished children and families with no access to healthcare or education. In Peru, the two men volunteered at the San Pablo leper colony on the banks of the Amazon River. Guevara worked as a medical assistant, treating patients afflicted with Hansen's disease. It was there that he began to articulate, even if privately, a vision of solidarity that went beyond national borders. He spoke of a pan-Latin American identity and began to question the artificial divisions between countries, arguing that the real struggle was between the oppressors and the oppressed. He increasingly saw himself as part of a broader continental struggle, not just an Argentine with medical ambitions. These experiences were recorded in his travel diaries, which would later be published as the Motorcycle Diaries. In those entries, one sees the emergence of a critical consciousness. Guevara was struck by the systemic nature of the poverty he witnessed, how it was not simply the result of bad luck or laziness, but of historical exploitation, colonial legacies, and structural inequality. The role of foreign powers, particularly the United States, in propping up corrupt regimes and monopolizing Latin America's resources became a recurring theme in his reflections. He was particularly affected by the plight of indigenous communities. In the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, he saw how native populations had been marginalized, denied education, political representation, and land rights. The racism and social exclusion they endured reminded him of Argentina's own hidden inequalities, despite the country's European veneer. Guevara began to see capitalism and imperialism not only as economic systems but as moral failures, systems that condemned millions to lives of preventable misery. The journey was also a test of physical and emotional endurance. Guevara's asthma flared up repeatedly, especially in high-altitude regions and in the jungle. Yet he pushed forward, often refusing to stop for treatment, determined to prove his toughness. This stubbornness, sometimes admired and sometimes criticized, would become a core part of his identity. His ability to endure hardship and his willingness to take personal risks became defining traits of the revolutionary he would soon become. As the trip came to an end in Caracas, Venezuela, Guevara and Granado parted ways. Granado chose to remain in Caracas to work in a leprosy clinic, while Guevara continued traveling briefly before returning to Argentina to finish his medical degree. But something had changed. He was no longer satisfied with the idea of treating individuals one at a time. He began to think seriously about how to transform society as a whole. The journey across Latin America served as an awakening. It exposed him to the realities of systemic injustice and planted the seeds of a revolutionary worldview. While he had not yet joined any political movement or declared any ideological affiliation, the contours of his future were beginning to take shape. He no longer saw medicine as an end in itself, but rather as a stepping stone toward a broader struggle for liberation. 5. From Guatemala to Mexico, Radicalization and Exile, 1953 to 1955. After completing his medical degree in 1953, Ernesto Guevara left Argentina once more, this time with a clearer sense of purpose. He was no longer just a curious traveler, he had begun to see himself as part of a continental mission. His next destination was Bolivia, followed by extended travel through Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and eventually Guatemala. Each stop added layers to his political development, exposing him further to the complexities of Latin America's social and political landscape. In Bolivia, he was particularly struck by the 1952 National Revolution, in which the leftist Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario, MNR, had overthrown the military regime. The MNR instituted a radical land reform, nationalized the country's mines, and expanded voting rights to indigenous populations. Guevara admired the scope of the revolution, but he also took note of its vulnerabilities. He saw how difficult it was for moderate socialist movements to maintain control in the face of conservative opposition and foreign interference. These observations reinforced his belief that deeper, more militant change might be necessary to achieve lasting justice. Continuing north through Peru and Ecuador, he witnessed the same social divisions he had seen during his earlier motorcycle journey. In Lima, he visited hospitals and clinics and stayed in poor neighborhoods, speaking with laborers, vendors, and students. He sought out Marxist bookstores and coffee houses, eager to absorb revolutionary ideas wherever they could be found. His arrival in Colombia coincided with a period of extreme political violence known as La Violencia, a civil conflict that had erupted between liberals and conservatives. The brutality of the street-level fighting, combined with the inability of the Colombian state to control the chaos, left a lasting impression on Guevara. It confirmed his view that institutional reforms, even if well-intentioned, were often incapable of withstanding the entrenched powers that upheld inequality. But it was in Guatemala that Guevara's transformation from a political observer to an active revolutionary truly began. In late 1953, he arrived in Guatemala City, where President Jacobo Arbenz was attempting to implement a sweeping land reform program aimed at redistributing and cultivated land from large corporations to peasant farmers. One of the most affected entities was the United Fruit Company, a powerful US-based corporation with deep ties to the American government. Guevara viewed Arbenz as a rare example of a democratic leader willing to challenge US imperialism and corporate control. Guevara was inspired by the Arbenz experiment and took it upon himself to study the reforms in detail. He frequented political meetings and developed contacts among leftist intellectuals and labor leaders. It was during this period that he met Hilda Guedilla, a Peruvian economist and Marxist activist. Guedilla introduced Guevara to more structured Marxist theory and to members of Guatemala's Communist Party. Their relationship was both romantic and political. Guedilla would later become his first wife and a significant influence on his ideological development. However, the progressive atmosphere in Guatemala was short-lived. In June 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup against Arbenz under the pretense of preventing the spread of communism. The operation, known as PBSES, used psychological warfare, propaganda, and support for a small rebel army to destabilize the government. The Guatemalan military withdrew its support from Arbenz, and he was forced to resign. The democratically elected government collapsed, and a US-friendly dictatorship was installed in its place. For Guevara, this event was a turning point. He saw the coup not only as a tragedy for Guatemala but as definitive proof that the United States would not tolerate even moderate leftist reforms in its geopolitical sphere. The idea that democracy alone could bring justice now seemed hopelessly naive. The lesson he drew was clear: any revolution that threatened the interests of US corporations and military strategy would be crushed, unless it had the force to defend itself. During the coup, Guevara briefly took shelter in the Argentine embassy and later fled the country. He became a political refugee, disillusioned but more committed than ever to the revolutionary path. He traveled to Mexico, where many leftist exiles from across Latin America were gathering. Mexico in the 1950s was a relatively tolerant place for political dissidents, and it offered a safe space for organizing, training, and planning future uprisings. It was in Mexico City, in 1955, that Guevara's life would change forever. Through mutual contacts, he was introduced to a group of Cuban exiles planning to overthrow the Batista dictatorship in Cuba. Among them were Raúl and Fidel Castro, two brothers who were organizing an armed uprising. Ernesto and Fidel met for the first time at a modest apartment in the city. Their conversation, which lasted all night, revealed a shared sense of urgency, idealism, and commitment to armed struggle. Fidel was impressed by Guevara's conviction and intellect. Guevara, in turn, was drawn to Fidel's clarity of purpose and charismatic leadership. Soon after, he joined the Movimiento 26 de Julio, the July 26 movement, named after Fidel's failed assault on the Moncada barracks in 1953. Guevara was no longer a wandering doctor or political observer. He had committed himself to an armed revolution. 6. Joining Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement, 1955 to 1956. By mid-1955, Ernesto Guevara had officially joined the July 26 movement, an underground revolutionary group led by Fidel Castro with the aim of toppling Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Fidel had been released from prison in Cuba following the failure of his 1953 Moncada barracks assault and had gone into exile in Mexico to reorganize. Mexico City served as a discreet but active hub for Latin American revolutionaries at the time, offering a space where exiles, leftist intellectuals, and dissidents could gather with relative freedom. Guevara quickly rose within the ranks of the Cuban exiles, not because of nationality, but due to his ideological commitment, discipline, and medical expertise. Unlike many others in the movement, he wasn't Cuban and had never set foot in Cuba. But Fidel saw in him a determined man who understood that armed struggle might be the only route to true liberation in Latin America. Guevara, in turn, admired Fidel's decisiveness and long-term strategic vision. The revolutionary group began conducting military training in secret, often using remote ranches or open land on the outskirts of the capital. Guevara participated in all aspects of the training, learning guerrilla tactics, small arms use, explosives, and survival techniques. He also took on the role of group medic, but it was clear early on that his contributions would extend far beyond medicine. In his notebooks and letters from this time, Guevara emphasized the importance of discipline, courage, and ideological clarity. He took a stern view of revolutionary ethics, believing that only those fully committed to the cause, both morally and physically, should be part of the struggle. This perspective earned him both admiration and fear among his comrades, who soon recognized him as uncompromising and willing to enforce harsh standards if necessary. By the fall of 1956, plans for the Cuban invasion were in motion. The group had acquired a small, worn-down yacht named Granma, which was to carry 82 men across the Gulf of Mexico to the southeastern coast of Cuba. The voyage was scheduled to coincide with an uprising by urban rebels within Cuba, with the goal of launching a two-pronged attack against the Batista regime. The date was ambitious and risky, and the Granma was dangerously overloaded. On the night of November 25, 1956, the rebels set sail from the port of Tuxpan in Veracruz. The journey was treacherous from the start. The vessel was overcrowded, undersupplied, and ill-equipped for the rough waters of the Gulf. Guevara suffered from asthma attacks during the voyage, compounded by seasickness and lack of sleep. Yet he remained committed, treating the sick and encouraging morale even as the situation worsened. After several days at sea, the Granma landed not at the intended point but in a swampy area near Playa Las Coloradas on December 2nd. The delay had cost them the element of surprise. Batista's forces were waiting. Almost immediately, the group came under attack. Many of the rebels were killed, captured, or scattered. Only a small band of survivors, fewer than 20, managed to regroup in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, among them Fidel, Raúl, and Che Guevara. During this initial clash, Guevara faced a decisive moment. Caught between helping the wounded and defending his comrades, he made the choice to pick up a rifle and return fire. It was a symbolic gesture, the moment he set aside his identity as a doctor and fully embraced his role as a combatant. From that point on, he would be known not simply as Ernesto Guevara, but as Che, a nickname given to him by his Cuban comrades because of his distinctive Argentine accent and habit of using the interjection Che, akin to dude or hey in Argentine Spanish. Once they reached the Sierra Maestra, Guevara emerged as one of the movement's most committed and disciplined figures. He was relentless in enforcing order and maintaining morale. He combined his medical skills with his growing leadership abilities, training others, organizing ambushes, and setting up rudimentary field hospitals. Though his rank was unofficial at first, his reputation as a strategist and disciplinarian earned him the respect of both his peers and his superiors. Che's letters and journal entries from this time reveal a man who had fully internalized the logic of armed revolution. He saw the fight in Cuba as more than a national struggle. It was the first step in what he hoped would become a continent-wide uprising against imperialism, exploitation, and inequality. The Cuban cause was not just about Cuba, it was a symbol of what was possible when committed revolutionaries challenged powerful regimes. The early phase in the Sierra Maestra was brutal. Supplies were scarce, and government troops launched repeated offensives against the small guerrilla force. Yet Guevara remained resolute. He advocated for treating captured enemy soldiers humanely, educating illiterate recruits, and embedding ideological training alongside military instruction. He believed that revolution was as much about consciousness as it was about gunfire. By the end of 1956, Guevara had transformed from a stateless exile into a core leader of an armed revolutionary movement. He was no longer simply a doctor with political convictions. He had become a military strategist, an ideologue, and a symbol of resistance. The journey that had begun in the classrooms of Buenos Aires and the villages of Guatemala had now entered its most dangerous and consequential phase. 7. The Cuban Revolution, from guerrilla to comandante, 1956 to 1959. The Cuban Revolution entered its most critical stage between 1956 and 1959, and Ernesto Che Guevara became one of its most visible and effective leaders. After regrouping in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, the small band of guerrillas faced enormous odds. Batista's army numbered in the tens of thousands, well-armed and supported by the United States with military equipment and intelligence. In contrast, the rebels initially had fewer than 24 fighters, limited ammunition, and minimal supplies. Despite these disadvantages, Guevara quickly distinguished himself through his ability to combine ideological clarity with tactical discipline. He was appointed the head of a column of fighters and tasked with organizing ambushes, recruiting locals, and establishing a functional command structure in his zone of operation. He proved adept at small unit tactics, using the terrain to his advantage, attacking isolated army posts, and vanishing before Batista's forces could retaliate. His leadership style was marked by strict discipline and a deep belief in revolutionary ethics. He insisted that all recruits, regardless of their background, adhere to a strict code of conduct. Theft from peasants, mistreatment of prisoners, or cowardice in combat were not tolerated. Guevara also pushed for literacy among the fighters and political education sessions after battles. He believed that guerrilla warfare was not just about military victory but about forming a new type of citizen, committed, educated, and selfless. As his unit grew in strength and reputation, Che was involved in several key engagements. Among the most important were the battles for El Uvero and Pino del Agua, where his leadership proved decisive. He also established logistical routes, coordinated with other rebel commanders, and ensured that civilian populations were treated respectfully, which helped build local support for the revolution. His mobile field hospitals gained praise even among the rural poor, who began to see the guerrillas not as bandits but as defenders of the people. By mid-1958, Che was promoted to Comandante, the highest rank in the rebel army. It was a title that carried enormous respect and responsibility. He was now seen as second only to Fidel Castro in influence. His writings during this time, such as Guerrilla Warfare, began to outline his emerging military doctrine, emphasizing mobility, the moral superiority of revolutionary fighters, and the importance of rural insurgency as a model for the rest of Latin America. In late 1958, Fidel ordered Che to lead a column of fighters westward across Cuba toward the central province of Las Villas. This march across the island, over 300 miles, nearly 500 kilometers, through hostile territory, was among the most daring operations of the revolution. Guevara and his men fought numerous skirmishes, sabotaged bridges, and derailed trains, all while evading Batista's troops and building alliances with local rebels and peasants. The culminating point came in December 1958 with the Battle of Santa Clara. Guevara led approximately 300 fighters in a series of coordinated attacks against heavily fortified positions. He used dynamite to derail a military supply train, cutting off reinforcements and sowing confusion among Batista's troops. After several days of intense fighting, Santa Clara fell to the rebels. It was a major turning point. Morale in Batista's army collapsed, and within days the dictator fled Cuba for the Dominican Republic. On January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana in a triumphal march. Che Guevara, now a national hero, took charge of the strategic city of La Habana. The revolution had succeeded, and the Batista regime was no more. But for Guevara, this was not the end of his struggle. It was the beginning of a much broader mission. In the weeks that followed, Che oversaw military tribunals of former Batista officials. His role in these trials remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. As commander of La Habana fortress, Guevara approved and oversaw the execution of dozens of individuals accused of torture, murder, and collaboration with the dictatorship. Supporters argued that these were acts of justice in a country without functioning legal institutions. Critics viewed them as summary executions. What is clear is that Guevara believed firmly in revolutionary justice and had little patience for due process as understood in liberal democracies. Yet even amid these difficult decisions, Che began to shift his focus toward building the new Cuban society. He saw the revolution not only as a transfer of power but as a transformation of values, where materialism would be replaced by solidarity and individualism by collective purpose. He gave speeches, wrote essays, and advocated for radical economic and social reforms. By the end of 1959, Che Guevara had emerged as not only a military hero but a political and ideological leader within the Cuban government. His fame had grown well beyond Cuba's borders. Images of the beret-wearing guerrilla had begun to circulate globally, turning him into an icon of resistance and revolution. 8. Architect of Revolutionary Cuba, 1959 to 1965. Following the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, Ernesto Che Guevara transitioned from battlefield commander to political architect. His transformation was rapid and dramatic. Within months of the revolution's success, he was placed at the heart of Cuba's new government, assuming a series of powerful positions that allowed him to shape policy, guide ideology, and represent the revolution abroad. Unlike many revolutionaries who struggled to adapt to governing, Guevara embraced the challenge, but not without controversy. In early 1959, Guevara was granted Cuban citizenship by the new government, an official recognition of his contributions to the revolution. He married Aleida March, a Cuban revolutionary he had met during the war, and they eventually had 4 children. Though he was now part of the Cuban political elite, Guevara maintained a Spartan lifestyle. He refused the privileges often associated with high office and was known for living modestly, dressing plainly, and working long hours. One of his first major roles was at La Habana fortress, where he continued to oversee the post-revolutionary tribunals. While these trials were defended by many Cubans as a necessary purge of Batista-era crimes, they also sparked international concern. Human rights organizations and Western governments criticized the lack of formal legal processes. Guevara responded by arguing that revolutionary justice operated under different moral frameworks than those of bourgeois democracies. He believed that defending the revolution required swift and decisive action. Despite, or perhaps because of, his controversial image, Guevara was soon appointed to positions of increasing responsibility. He was named president of the National Bank of Cuba in late 1959, a surprising move considering his lack of formal training in economics. When asked why he had accepted the role, he reportedly replied, "Because no one else would do it." Guevara signed banknotes with a single word, Che, symbolizing his rejection of formality and capitalist tradition. As bank president, he focused on restructuring Cuba's monetary system, curbing inflation, and ending the country's dependence on the US dollar. He nationalized foreign banks and encouraged trade relationships with the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. His goal was to sever Cuba's economic dependence on the United States, which had dominated Cuban trade and investment for decades. Guevara also became Minister of Industry, overseeing the country's ambitious economic transformation. He spearheaded efforts to nationalize major industries, centralize planning, and transition Cuba toward a state-controlled economy. Inspired by Marxist theory and Soviet-style planning, he hoped to create an economic model that served human needs rather than profit. However, these initiatives faced serious challenges. Cuba lacked the technical expertise, infrastructure, and diversified economy needed for such a rapid transition. The country's economy was still heavily reliant on sugar exports, and the loss of trade with the United States, due to the embargo imposed in 1960, created severe shortages of goods and materials. Guevara's emphasis on moral incentives over material rewards also drew criticism. He believed that true socialism required the creation of a new man, a citizen who worked not for personal gain, but for the collective good. He promoted volunteer labor brigades, where people worked for free on weekends to help build roads, harvest crops, or construct housing. Guevara himself participated regularly in such activities, leading by example and reinforcing his image as a committed idealist. Yet these moral campaigns often clashed with economic reality. Productivity declined in many sectors, and morale among workers sometimes suffered. Critics within the Cuban government, many of whom favored more pragmatic, Soviet-style models, argued that Guevara's vision was unrealistic and unsustainable. Tensions grew between Guevara and other leaders, including some within Fidel Castro's inner circle, as policy debates intensified. Despite these domestic challenges, Guevara remained one of Cuba's most prominent international figures. He traveled extensively as a diplomat and revolutionary ambassador, visiting the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Egypt, Algeria, and other newly independent or socialist-aligned nations. He delivered speeches at international conferences and at the United Nations, where his fiery rhetoric and denunciations of U.S. foreign policy drew both applause and outrage. In his 1964 speech at the Union General Assembly in New York, Guevara accused the United States of imperialism, racism, and hypocrisy. He condemned U.S. actions in Vietnam, its support for dictators in Latin America, and its treatment of African Americans. Speaking in fluent Spanish with a translator beside him, he electrified supporters of anti-colonial movements and alienated Western diplomats. The image of Che Guevara at the UN, defiant and uncompromising, became a defining symbol of Third World resistance. As the 1960s progressed, however, Guevara began to feel increasingly constrained by the realities of state building. The compromises required to maintain power, the bureaucratic inefficiencies of the new government, and the growing dependency on Soviet aid troubled him deeply. He had hoped that the Cuban Revolution would spark a wave of uprisings across Latin America, but those revolutions had failed to materialize. Worse still, many leftist movements were being crushed with U.S. support. Guevara grew disillusioned with the Soviet Union, criticizing it for its bureaucratism, lack of internationalism, and what he viewed as a betrayal of true socialist principles. He began to distance himself from Moscow's influence, advocating instead for a more radical, independent socialism. His criticisms were not always welcomed by Cuban leaders, who relied heavily on Soviet trade and military support to sustain the regime. By 1965, Guevara had largely disappeared from the public eye in Cuba. His last official appearance was in Algiers, where he gave a controversial speech criticizing the Soviet Union for exploiting Third World countries under the guise of socialist solidarity. After that, he vanished from Cuban political life. Rumors swirled. Some said he was dead, others claimed he had fallen out with Fidel. The truth was more complex. Che had made a decision. He would leave Cuba to reignite the global revolution elsewhere. Convinced that Latin America still held revolutionary potential, and unwilling to settle into a life of governance, he chose to return to the battlefield. In a farewell letter to Fidel Castro, which was made public months later, he wrote, "Other nations are calling for the help of my modest efforts. I can do that which is denied you because of your responsibilities, and I carry the faith you have placed in me." 9. Internationalist campaigns, Congo and Bolivia, 1965 to 1967. By the spring of 1965, Che Guevara had vanished from public life in Cuba. His departure was shrouded in secrecy. Few knew his whereabouts, and even fewer knew his intentions. The truth emerged only much later. Guevara had quietly left Cuba to begin a new chapter in his revolutionary life, this time as an internationalist guerrilla fighter attempting to ignite global uprisings beyond Cuba's borders. He believed the Cuban Revolution was only the beginning of a much larger struggle against imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism. His first destination, the Congo. The choice of the Congo, located in Central Africa, was strategic. The country had descended into chaos following the 1961 assassination of its first democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, a figure Guevara deeply admired. Lumumba's death, widely believed to have been orchestrated by Western powers, including the CIA and Belgian intelligence, left a power vacuum filled by various armed factions. Among them was Laurent Desire Kabila, a Congolese revolutionary who sought to reclaim Lumumba's vision through guerrilla warfare. Guevara saw in Kabila a potential partner in building a new socialist state in Africa. Che arrived in the Congo under a false identity and with a small group of Cuban fighters. His plan was to support Kabila's rebel forces in fighting the pro-Western government backed by mercenaries and foreign troops. However, from the beginning, the mission was plagued by challenges. Guevara encountered a lack of discipline among the Congolese fighters, widespread disorganization, and political divisions within the rebel camp. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and logistical difficulties further hindered their efforts. Guevara's frustration grew as it became clear that Kabila lacked the military command and revolutionary commitment necessary to sustain an insurgency. Many of the Congolese troops were demoralized and unwilling to engage in serious combat. They often abandoned their posts, retreated without orders, and disregarded Guevara's advice. Despite months of planning and training, the campaign failed to gain momentum. The Cubans were unable to secure significant victories, and their presence attracted increasing attention from Western intelligence agencies. Guevara fell ill with dysentery and suffered recurring asthma attacks in the Congolese jungle. He came to view the operation as a failure. In his diary, he wrote with deep disillusionment, "This is a story of a failure. But it is also the story of men who fought with all their might to change the fate of a continent." After 7 months, the mission was aborted. The Cuban fighters were quietly evacuated, and Guevara returned to Cuba under complete secrecy. Rather than retire or re-enter politics, Che turned immediately to planning his next campaign. He had not abandoned the dream of global revolution. Though deeply discouraged by the experience in Africa, he believed that Latin America, his home continent, offered more favorable terrain. Bolivia, a landlocked country in South America with a long history of indigenous resistance and peasant struggle, became his next target. Guevara chose Bolivia for both symbolic and strategic reasons. The country's geography, rugged, mountainous, and heavily forested, was ideal for guerrilla warfare. Moreover, its location at the heart of South America meant that a successful revolution there could influence neighboring countries. The plan was bold: establish a rural insurgency in Bolivia, win over local peasants, and eventually create a continental cordillera of fire stretching from the Andes to the Amazon. In late 1966, Guevara secretly entered Bolivia under the alias Ramon. He and a small group of fighters, composed of Cubans, Bolivians, and a few international volunteers, set up a base in the Nankawazu region, a remote and mountainous area in southeastern Bolivia. The environment was harsh, but Guevara was in his element. He resumed the dual role of commander and medic, treating injuries, training recruits, and writing tactical and ideological materials. From the start, however, the campaign was met with severe obstacles. Unlike in Cuba, the Bolivian peasants were often wary of the guerrillas. Many did not share Guevara's revolutionary vision and feared government retaliation. The lack of local support limited recruitment and made it difficult to gather intelligence or secure supplies. Meanwhile, the Bolivian government, led by President René Barrientos, had become aware of the guerrilla presence and acted quickly. With the assistance of the United States, especially the CIA and Green Beret advisors, Bolivia launched a coordinated counterinsurgency campaign. U.S. personnel trained Bolivian rangers and provided surveillance and equipment to help track the guerrillas. Over the course of several months, Guevara's group was slowly hunted down. They were cut off from communication with Cuba, faced severe shortages of food and medicine, and endured constant attacks. By mid-1967, the insurgency was reduced to a few dozen fighters. Morale dropped, and the group became increasingly isolated in the dense Bolivian forest. Despite the hopeless situation, Guevara refused to abandon the mission. He continued to write in his diary, analyze each failed maneuver, and inspire his men to press forward. His entries reveal a man who, though physically exhausted and aware of the mounting odds, remained ideologically unbroken. In early October 1967, after months of running battles, Che's small band was ambushed near the village of La Higuera. Guevara was wounded, captured, and taken to a nearby schoolhouse. The Bolivian army, under pressure from U.S. advisors, debated whether to bring him to trial or eliminate him quickly to avoid a spectacle. 10. Final days in La Higuera, October 1967. On the morning of October 8, 1967, near the small ravine of Quebrada del Uro in southeastern Bolivia, Ernesto Che Guevara was ambushed and captured by Bolivian army rangers. His final gun battle had been brief. He was wounded in the legs and taken alive, disarmed but still defiant. His rifle was damaged, his pistol empty. He identified himself to his captors and requested medical care for the injured among his remaining comrades, several of whom had been killed in the firefight. Guevara was transported to the nearby village of La Higuera, a remote and impoverished mountain settlement. There, he was held in a small, one-room adobe schoolhouse with dirt floors, cracked walls, and a single wooden window. Photos taken by soldiers show him dirty, bruised, and gaunt, his beard tangled, his uniform torn. Still, he held himself upright and refused to beg or show fear. According to witnesses, he remained calm throughout his detention, even as he understood the gravity of his situation. The Bolivian army, unsure of how to proceed, quickly consulted with their American advisors. CIA operatives on the ground, including Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban exile working for the agency, interviewed Guevara briefly. Rodriguez later claimed that Che refused to cooperate but carried himself with pride and clarity, making a final appeal for the cause of Latin American unity and anti-imperialism. 4 hours, high-level Bolivian officials debated his fate. Some considered putting him on trial to demonstrate the legitimacy of their counterinsurgency efforts. Others, fearing that a public trial would make him a martyr and draw international attention to Bolivia's internal conflicts, pushed for a swift execution. Ultimately, President René Barrientos gave the order. Che Guevara was to be executed without trial. On the morning of October 9, 1967, a Bolivian sergeant named Mario Terán was selected to carry out the execution. Nervous and hesitant, he was said to have drawn straws with other soldiers. When he entered the schoolhouse, Guevara reportedly looked him in the eyes and said, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." These final words, whether exactly as spoken or paraphrased in later retellings, became iconic. Che was shot multiple times, primarily in the chest and legs, to simulate death in combat. His body was then tied to the skids of a helicopter and flown to the nearby town of Valle Grande, where it was displayed to local and international journalists. The Bolivian military hoped the images would serve as proof that the insurgency had been crushed and that Guevara's myth could be extinguished with photographic evidence. The display had the opposite effect. Photos of Che's lifeless body, lying on a concrete slab with his eyes open, quickly circulated around the world. The scene reminded many observers of religious imagery, his partially open eyes and limp arms evoking comparisons to depictions of Christ. The image became one of the most reproduced in modern history, further cementing Che's status as a global symbol of resistance. His body was secretly buried in an unmarked grave outside Valle Grande, along with several of his comrades. The Bolivian military refused to disclose the burial site, fearing it would become a pilgrimage destination for leftists and activists. For decades, the exact location remained unknown. Che Guevara's personal belongings, including his diary, were seized by the Bolivians and eventually turned over to the CIA. The diary, written in neat handwriting and filled with tactical notes, ideological reflections, and frustrations with the Bolivian campaign, was later published by Cuba as the Bolivian Diary of Ernesto Che Guevara. It became a key text for understanding his final thoughts and motivations. In the years that followed, Guevara's legend grew. His face, captured in the famous photo taken by Alberto Corda during the Cuban Revolution, became an international icon, reproduced on posters, shirts, murals, and books. For supporters, he remained a symbol of courage, anti-imperialism, and the unyielding fight for justice. For critics, he was a militant ideologue, willing to use violence in pursuit of utopian goals. But regardless of perspective, few could deny the power of his story. A middle-class Argentine doctor who became a guerrilla fighter, helped overthrow a dictatorship, guided a new nation's future, and ultimately gave his life trying to expand his revolutionary vision across continents. Thanks for watching this full biography of Che Guevara. His life continues to provoke debate and inspire movements around the world. If you'd like to learn more about historical figures like him, here are 2 more videos you might enjoy. First, Fidel Castro, the revolutionary who defied the US. Second, Simon Bolivar, the liberator of South America.